She is president-elect of the American Economic History Association. In over 150 scholarly publications and many other writings, podcasts, and media appearances, she has argued that women and their economic activities must be included in socioeconomic analysis, not just to make accounts complete, but to make them correct. Recently, she has worked on constructing long-run wage series for men on annual contracts and for women and children, and combining this with estimates of economic participation rates to reconstruct family incomes over time and space and by family size and structure. Her work has won many prizes and awards. A fellow of the Academics of Social Sciences, the British Academy, and the Cliometric Society. She has awarded a CBE for services to social science and economic history in 2018 and has received honorary degrees from the Universities of Uppsala and Sheffield. So this is a very, very succinct summary of what I could say of Professor Humphries. And Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carmen. I would like to add here that many economic historians working in Spain, and in fact, of course, Carmen herself, have contributed to the same projects that concern me. So, there is admiration on my side too. Historical standard of living and how this has led to a big boom in studies of wages and labor, and some of the concepts, methods, and emerging problems of this approach. Many of you, of course, are working in this area and will be very familiar with some of the things I say. So, of course, as economic historians, one of our primary interests is in looking at the standard of living historically and trying to measure material progress. This is the aim of economic activity. And of course, it also indicates an efficient economic organization and comparatively, the relative performance of different economic systems and different countries at different times and places. So we look at the standard of living in terms of changes over time to index progress. Of course, very recently, we've come to think a little bit more carefully about progress, and perhaps that growth may not be the overall aim of society. But until quite recently, it has been held up as the holy grail of economic activity. But we're also interested in the standard of living because its variation across space, across groups, across regions, across households, indicates inequality. And this too is something that we're very concerned with. Both growth and inequality are the object of economic policy. So it's very important to understand how they evolve in order to really understand economic policy initiatives and to find the best way forward. Right to a decent standard of living is, of course, a basic human right written into many lists of what constitutes the basic human rights agenda. I want to emphasize that what I'm going to be talking about is to do with the standard of living and not the quality of life, which is a rather different set of themes and initiatives. And in particular here, of course, we're really interested in measuring the standard of living, and we have to problematize how to obtain consistent historical measures. This is extremely difficult, of course, but it is actually easier than attempting to look at the quality of life. But I think we do need to remind ourselves periodically that what we're looking at is the material basis of living standards, and that there are other things that we may want to consider if we want to take a broader perspective. Well, when we turn to measuring the standard of living, this, of course, is a bread and butter issue, as I said, for economic historians. And it very often involves looking at GDP per capita and reconstructing national income. But we have also looked at consumption per capita, the famous article by Joel Mulcair, for example, turning attention to consumption per capita as an index of living standards. And we've also tried to cover evidence gaps where we cannot use these rather conventional economistic approaches to living standards by turning to biological indices, looking at anthropometric measures like height, like life expectancy, and even more demanding of the data, recently looking at body mass indices and other biological indicators of well-being. But by far and away, the most focus has been on wages. And that's because, of course, wages have left a lot of residue in our sources, in archival sources. And what we're really interested in here is not nominal wages, not money values of what workers in different times and places were paid, but what those wages could buy. That's the index of the living standards. So what we're interested in is taking wages and deflating those wages by a measure of the cost of living, a cost of a representative consumption basket. So this, of course, is a hugely demanding project. Even economists of the world today find it very difficult to measure wages, and they find it very difficult too to look at a representative consumption basket. And so when you're doing this using historical evidence, of course, this is very demanding, both in terms of the nominal wage side and in terms of the cost of living side. But hard as the project is, the goal is really very important. And that is because there are huge debates around the standard of living. And the largest debate in economic history in terms of pages of journals, in terms of the energy that's gone into exchanges and so on, has been about the British Industrial Revolution. And that's because the study of wages in this particular context has been interpreted as a judgment on capitalism, a judgment on unregulated capitalism. Here we see an economy in very we used to think very short order, undergoing industrialization. It's huge development of its capitalist institutions and its capitalist reach. How quickly did that economy, as it boomed in terms of productivity, how quickly did those gains trickle down to workers? That was the question. And that really provided a judgment on the capitalist system in an unregulated form, delivering benefits to working people. And the debate here, of course, was between optimists who said, yes, it was very, very, living standards rose dramatically, versus pessimists who were much more cautious about the time frame within which the benefits were delivered to those people whose efforts had mainly secured that growth. Those first generations of economic historians struggled with fragmentary quantitative evidence in this context, and there was a drift away to qualitative evidence and a slippage into discussion of the quality of life, especially on the pessimistic side. But the debate, this initial debate, left a significant quantitative legacy, especially in terms of wage and price series. And this has been both, I think, very good, but also perhaps has a downside for economic historians who've tended to use and reuse and reuse and reuse some of the same evidence instead of striking out and trying to add new material to the sources that we deploy. And I would like to urge students and researchers to think of adding material, of bringing new sources to bear and new perspectives to bear on living standards. Nonetheless, interest in this topic has continued. And there's recently been what my colleague, colleagues at LSE have described as an explosion of wage studies, both in the UK and internationally, including the Global South, an explosion of studies of wages in order to try and get at the issue of living standards. So what's been the theoretical stimuli then for wage studies? We know how I've just sketched how important they are to our overall agenda and how the historiography of living standards has directed us towards them. But there have also been theoretical developments that have added to the always ongoing standard of living debates. One theoretical theme has been arguments about the Industrious Revolution. And here, and of course, the classic work on this front is by Jane Humphries, who argued that it was, in fact, a change in behavior, a switch of labor time from households, from subsistence production, and from leisure to working for the market in order to access, his brain, in order to access newly available goods and services, particularly the newly available tropical groceries that came out of imperial exploitation of other places by various advanced industrial European countries, particularly Britain, of course. So de Vries's argument was there was an industrious revolution as people, in fact, worked harder and longer in the market in order to access this new consumption. And it was this that drove modern economic growth, not necessarily an increase in productivity per se. A second theoretical theme has been unified growth theory, which tried to understand an escape from Malthusian stagnation in the context also of modern economic growth. So it was an attempt to fit together escape from a situation where inevitably any improvements in living standards were eroded by population increase, to fit that into a longer run experience where we did see both increases in population and increases in living standards at the same time. Wage studies have also really been motivated by thinking about comparative economic development. I think this has probably been the most significant impulse behind that explosion in wage studies. And in particular, trying to look at when was it and where was it that Europe steamed ahead of Asia, and which had enjoyed technological leadership for certain periods of time, at least according to some scholars. So we needed those wage series in order to be able to look at comparative economic development, and in particular to look at the great divergence in experience between Europe and many other countries in the very long term. And within these comparative studies, of course, there has also been interest in how it was that within Europe, Northwest Europe, particularly Britain and the Netherlands, took over leadership of economic growth and standards from erstwhile leaders, particularly the northern Italian city-states, who had enjoyed relatively high living standards and prosperity earlier on in time, in the late medieval, early modern period. Then we've also seen very significant impulse into studying wages from the intervention of my colleague Robert Allen, who very cleverly turned wages from being an output of the economic system to thinking about wage levels as being an input into industrialization. So Bob's argument was that it was the relatively high wages that prevailed in England that prompted the substitution of capital for labor, and therefore promoted innovation, particularly the great macro inventions as he lists them, the spinning jenny, changes in the metallurgical industry, and so on, these big macro inventions that boosted productivity and stimulated the Industrial Revolution. So wages in this model become a cause rather than a consequence of economic growth. And finally, of course, many gender historians, and of course I include myself here and Carmen Sarasua, have really been concerned with how to compile individual wages, particularly wages for workers who have been in the mainstream considered peripheral, like women and children, more than 50% of the population, how to combine those with men's wages and somehow achieve indices of family living standards over time. So these meta-narratives really cannot be pursued empirically unless we have good wage studies, labor markets and their outcomes. And this is why the history of work and the history of labor and wages really are so important in our agenda. Today, I'm going to particularly focus on the high wage economy themes and industrialization. And here you see a rather standard account. This is nominal day wages, and I've shown you here how there is significant agreement between Robert Allen's construction of the wages of unskilled English male workers and Greg Clark's slightly later series. So let me spend a few minutes then on the high wage economy and industrialization and Allen's interpretation. And I've emphasized that in this view, wages move from being a dependent variable in the economic system, the outcome of how efficient organization is and so on, how skilled the workers are, to becoming an explanatory variable, to becoming, in fact, an account of the impulse, the motives to invest in capital equipment and to really to precipitate industrialization, to precipitate mechanization, the use of capital instead of labor, factory production, and so on. But what I'm also interested in is what these wages could buy, so the estimation of real wages. And in the high wage economy thesis, this involves a move to what Bob Allen called and has now become entrenched in the literature, welfare ratios. So these are wages divided by the cost of a representative consumption basket, a basket of consumer goods that the average worker might well be able to consume. And I want to note here, because this does relate to my current work, is that although a wage ratio can represent one way of approaching living standards of individual workers, it also raises the problem of what would be included in a basket for a family and how economic historians might aggregate up to family consumption when they're deflating family incomes. So a wage rate, initial arguments were simply to multiply by 3 or 3.5. And this is, again, very commonly done in the literature today. But we might really start to worry about a wage rate really an appropriate way forward, just to use a rule of thumb of this kind. Can we not do better than this in terms of looking at how family structures might influence what is needed in that basket? And in fact, trying to cost up and there are, I know there's some very interesting work going on in Spain here, which tries to look at living standards through baskets when these are costed up in terms of calories, in terms of diets that would be a wage efficient for people to enjoy. So lots of work to be done there on the nature of the baskets and how we might conceptualize and measure the cost of living. So here's a summary then of how the traditional literature, the conventional literature, treats the movement from nominal wages to welfare ratios. We take wages, nominal wages, and then we take a consumption basket. And Bob Allen, again, did a great service to the profession by providing two types of baskets. First of all, a so-called respectability basket, which is relatively, he and other scholars have thought was relatively generous in terms of the calories that it provided, in terms of the quality of diet and clothing that it provides, and a more basic, literally, as he described it, bare bones basket, a subsistence basket, essentially, which delivers less calories, a less nutritionally satisfying diet, and more basic clothing and domestic support. But this is really a very important key then to our comparative work, because these baskets can be costed up in terms of what it would cost to buy these quantities and types of goods at different times in different places. And in this way, we can compare the cost of living in different countries across Europe. And I notice here that quite a lot of the very current work is motivated to tweak these baskets, to reconstruct these baskets for particular national contexts, particular cultural situations, particular climatic conditions. You would obviously need more clothing, more warm clothing, if you were thinking of a respectability basket in the Russian state in the 17th, 18th century, to compare it with, for example, climatic conditions in the Mediterranean region. So these are obvious issues. And young scholars like Catherine Gary at Lund, for instance, has worked on tweaking, on adjusting the consumption basket to deal with some of these issues. And I know also that this is something that Spanish scholars would be interested in working on. I also want to draw people's attention to the fact that all of these issues around the baskets, what they should contain, how they should be costed up, how we move to family living standards, as well as the wages themselves, have been the subject of very intensive debates, particularly in Oxford, in my home university. And of course, I want to draw attention here to a lot of work that's been done by various scholars. I have been involved myself, but many other people have contributed to these debates. And of course, these debates have now spilled over into the European arena more generally, and many Spanish scholars are very intensively involved in thinking through some of these issues. The back. Let's try and stand back from the basket methodology and look at what it gives us. It's a very useful addition to our historiography. It enables comparisons over space and time. And this allows us to explore global trends in real income. And so the timing and extent of great and little divergence. And you only need to open any of our journals in recent years to see how many contributions there are using welfare ratios to try and get at relative, comparative economic development. And this has been very exciting set of developments. And also, of course, we can use the basket methodology to enable exploration of national trends and so inform standards of living debate and ideas about long-run economic development and the escape from Malthusian stagnation. And there is, however, concern over wage construction. And I'm going to talk in a minute particularly about the work I've done with Jacob Weisdorf on one aspect of this concern. But this concern was fueled in the English case, particularly by the discovery of inconsistency between developments in wages and developments in GDP per head from most national income reconstructions, and in particular, of course, from Steve Broadberry et al.'s recent, very detailed reconstruction of British national income in the very long run. And the fact that real wages, as constructed through the baskets, and GDP per head appeared to be out of synchronization, I think should really worry economic historians. There's something wrong there, as we will see in a minute. And in fact, one aspect of this inconsistency, which ties us back into some of those earlier debates about industriousness, is the assumption when going from the historical sources, which by and large provide us with data on wage rates by the day, to in fact construct annual incomes, that we assume a fixed, unchanging number of days were worked in the year. So that the assumption has been 250 or 260 days of work over massive amounts of space and time, that is an unchanging length of the working year. And not only is this historically difficult to justify, just on the basis of casual experience in the archives, for example, but it's also really out of it challenges, or it's challenged by the ideas of, for example, Jan de Vries and the people who embrace the idea of an industrious revolution. Well, as well as worries over the numerator of the welfare ratio, there's also been worries about the basket construction. Many people argued, I myself have argued this, that the subsistence basket provides insufficient calories, particularly for workers who are engaging in the heavy labor of the early industrial and medieval economies. The basket is also a Las Perez index, so it ignores, well, it's by and large a Las Perez index. So it ignores new goods. And so, of course, again, it's out of synchronization with the importance attached to new commodities, particularly to tropical groceries and lighter fabrics that are behind the industrious revolution of Jan de Vries. And I've already mentioned the need to edit the baskets for national contexts, climate, local agriculture, custom, dietary cultures, and so on. And finally, moving from the individual to family baskets is deeply problematical and often involves hidden assumptions to do with sharing within families, to do with family size, to do with family structure, and so on. And again, what I'm going to pick out for a closer discussion today is concern over wage construction. Although I emphasize that my most recent work, the stuff that I'm working on right now, is more to do with the basket construction than the numerator of the welfare ratio. But what we're really going to close in a little bit on today is this unchanging length of the working year. It's okay. So again, to go back, this is showing you the basket construction, showing you real wages as produced by both Allen and Clark and GDP per capita. And what you can see immediately is that there's really a lack of long-run synchronization in the British data here. So that both Allen and Clark show a huge boom in wages in the period following the Black Death, very consistent with classical economic history writing here, because this is the golden age of the English peasant, which comes about as a result of course, an enormous labor shortage that follows the Black Death. That labor shortage maintained by periodic revisitations of plague. And it's only when we get into the era of industrialization at the end of the 18th century that we see population recovering. But at this point, as far as these two series are concerned, we see that GDP per capita, of course, grows much more rapidly in this time period than real wages. So there really is some lack of consistency and coherence in the evolution of wages and the evolution of GDP per capita, when we would expect them to really move together. So this is showing you another picture which shows the same. It shows you the indices of real income and the indices of GDP per capita. So this is the income from day worked, multiplying days by 250 days. We're assuming 250 days of wage labor going into annual incomes. And we see that then is really, again, out of kilter with the developments in GDP per capita in those same ways that GDP per capita grows much more slowly in the late medieval, early part of the early modern period, and then grows much more rapidly than real wages did in the era of industrialization. So this leads into work that I did with Jacob Weisdorf, where we focused on this lack of synchronization. And we argued that essentially the real wage series that economic historians had developed suffered from serious deficiencies. And we had two contributions which channeled the traditional view. The first was that we offered a new income series, which was based not on grossing up day wages, but on annual wages, which are found in large numbers in the historical record in Britain, and also it's now emerging from new studies right across Western Europe, that we can get data on annual wages and use these as a basis for annual incomes instead of simply aggregating up day wages by multiplying by 250. And the new income series allows us to estimate the number of days worked. And this is really, I think, a very something that economic historians need to work on right now. And this is, in fact, one of the things that I am currently working on. So, but the paper with Jacob in 2018, 2019, really is an attempt to both provide annual income indices and to look at the number of days work. And we have two key findings that I'll tell you now, and we can. I'm kind of giving you. This is a spoiler for the rest of the talk, that we get modern economic growth in England begins around 1600, rather than the classical dating of the Industrial Revolution. That chronology appears to be wrong. And more important than that, perhaps even, the main driving force was increased work. It was an industrious revolution. And of course, that really raises lots of questions about well-being if we think that people were perhaps enjoying higher living standards in the terms of material possessions, but they were working harder and longer in order to enjoy those standards. So just to go back over the methodology here, how is real income obtained in most conventional studies? I've already emphasized we have a male worker, day worker usually, and we assume he works 250 days in the year. We look at day labor, and of course, it doesn't really, the fragmentary evidence that we have here is not consistent with that. So let's get rid of that assumption, and let's take our full year-round annual worker and take his annual rates. And annual servants, for instance, or other types of annual workers have actually been rather strangely neglected by historians of wages hitherto, which is strange because you can use annual wages to read annual incomes directly from historical records. You don't need to make the assumption of 250 or 260 days of work in the year. And one reason why annual servants' wages were ignored in the literature is that they very frequently received other perquisites as well as their cash wages. They lived in with their employer, and so this means that we have to impute a value to their board and lodging and add this to the cash wage they receive in order to understand what their annual incomes were. And what I'm going to show later is that if we can assume labor market arbitrage, so we can assume that both employers and workers can move between annual work and day work, then we can use a comparison of annual wages and day wages to actually infer the length of the working year. And that's a very important project, as I've tried to emphasize. So we're junking the traditional approach, and we're focusing on annual workers, but we have the problem of imputing a value to the board and lodging that they enjoy from their employer. And we did this in our initial work in the paper in the Economic Journal. We did this by adding in the value of an Allen basket to the cash wage that an annual worker who lived in would receive. And we added in the value of the respectability basket because we believed that that was more appropriate, more historically representative of what workers required and enjoyed. And then we looked at to what extent using the bare bones basket to value board and lodging, to what extent that would change our findings. So that really acts as a kind of robustness check on this exercise. So our new approach then focuses on a year-round worker, the annual rate of pay he received, plus the value of an Allen respectability basket. This shows you the number of payments that we extracted primarily from archival resources per decade. And you can see that we have quite a lot of data. And it's data that is from a large number of sources. And this is an issue. I want to emphasize this, not because I want a pat on the back for my archival research, although I do deserve a pat on the back for my archival research. But the problem here is that you need to go to lots of different sources to get a sufficient sample size. You can't just go to one archive and one source and get sufficient data. So this becomes a very labor-intensive activity. And of course, then you have issues too of shifting composition within the data set, and you have to be rather careful about how you control for compositional switches and shifts. There are really serious difficulties here that need to be at least addressed in some ways. Just one example of a source here. Here you see this is a domestic worker, and it tells you what his living his wages, and we would then add in an index of the value of his board and lodging using the cost of an Allen respectability basket in this year. I think it's 1738 from the source. Let me turn now then to results. 3 results I want to emphasize. I want to show you how the traditional story relates to our new annual wage estimates. And I want to emphasize why we're now confident that our new wages are more exact and more historically accurate than the traditional story. And I want to start to work towards a length of the working year analysis. So the traditional real income of unskilled males, I've already shown you this picture many times in many variants. This shows you the massive golden age that follows the Black Death, followed by a very long Malthusian plateau, with recovery really only beginning in the 19th century with industrialization. And I've shown you that this does not synchronize well with GDP per capita. Well, here is the traditional, conventional real income series, along with our new, real wage series, along with our new annual real wage series. And you can see the differences. We still have a golden age following the Black Death, but it's a much reduced, it's a much tempered golden age. Yes, the peasants benefited from the horrendous demographic shock of the Black Death, but they did so to a much lesser extent than we might infer from day wages. And growth in wages begins much earlier than in the traditional story. And we can date modern economic growth more from, say, 1600 than from, say, 1800. So early modern economic growth really comes earlier. Why are we confident our new series is more exact? Well, there are 2 key reasons. The first is that it provides a much better fit with GDP per capita. And a second reason is that when we have occasional bits of data that tell us what wages that were paid in kind were worth, and when workers who were customarily boarded with their families, with their employers, what those wages were valued at, we can compare these occasional historical valuations with our rather crude use, for example, of an Allen basket to indicate the value of board and lodging. So let's look at the fit with GDP per capita. There you see the little circles of GDP per capita. And I've shown you the real income from day wages, assuming 250 days worked. I've shown you this picture many, many times now. You're bored with it, I'm sure. But there is real income from day rates and GDP per capita and real income from annual work. So as you can see, our real income from annual work tracks GDP per capita much better than does the day rates aggregated up using 250 days of work. In other words, what we're really showing here is that it's the assumption of 250 days of work per year that really is behind that inconsistency between GDP per capita and the real wage series. And what this means is that if we want to explain that inconsistency, we have to argue that in the earlier period, there was in fact less time spent working, which meant that day wages really overestimate income per capita. And from about 1600 onwards, there was more time spent working. And so day wages multiplied up by 250 or 260 actually underestimates the amount of income that workers could earn. Also, we show here that if we look at those fragmentary indicators of very rare observations of what workers did receive in terms of total incomes from their employers, we can see that they are very consistent with our estimates of annual income using the value of an Allen basket to proxy for the value that workers receive by living in with their employers and being fed by their employers. All right, now let's move to how we've used this work to try and guess out the length of the working year. Well, the traditional approach and our new approach might well be held to be equal, in equilibrium, assuming arbitrage in the labor market. And this was an idea that was originally suggested in an article by Greg Clark and Van der Werf, who argues that in equilibrium, assuming workers and employers could in fact decide whether to use a day worker or a full year worker, or the worker could choose whether he was going to work by the day or by the year, then in fact, the cost and the return of a day's labor, or an hour's labor even, would in fact be the same in both contractual types, in both segments of this labor market. Now, I don't believe that this idea of arbitrage and the mobility of workers and employers is historically accurate. But let's just go along with our economists' myth here and assume arbitrage in the labor market. I'm going to try and use this idea of arbitrage to estimate the length of the working year. And here we have a scatter diagram that shows some independent estimates of days worked per year. And of course, these are subject to all kinds of caveats and questions, you know, I can't here, I don't have time to go into where they come from and why we think they might be representative of how long the working year was and so on. You just have to take my word for this. But now what I've done is I've assumed, and I probably should go back a minute here, because if we assume equality and equilibrium between the returns for workers and the cost to employers of a unit of labor, whether it's day work or annual work, then in fact, working days can be inferred by dividing annual wages by daily wages. That's just an arithmetic equality. If day work times working days is equal to annual rates, then working days must equal annual rates divided by day wage rates. And that's exactly how we get our series here. We simply divided our estimates of annual incomes by other people's estimates of day wages. And you can see how our estimates here of the length of the working year pick up those scattered estimates of days worked in the sources. And of course, what they do show is a long-run evolution of industriousness, with workers in the era of industrialization working much longer working years than they did in the medieval period or the early modern period. I'm going to skip this as a matter of time, but if you're interested, what the paper does, what the 2017 working paper does, is it actually looks at whether our findings are sensitive to that assumption of arbitrage in the labor market. So here we vary the model of arbitrage to suggest that perhaps the casual day worker gets a premium for shouldering the insecurity of day work relative to annual work. And then we take also into account the fact that the number of annual workers falls in the economy over time. And so our annual wage is becoming a less and less representative indicator for the average worker. And we build both of these responses to historical reality into our model, and we rework the data. And you can see that there really is not that much adjustment as a result of trying to vary the values of alpha and beta here, representing the proportion of workers who are actually working on annual contracts in the economy, and whether or not day workers were rewarded with a premium for the insecurity of day work in comparison to an annual contract. But if you buy my argument that the length of the working year increased dramatically over the course of economic development in England, the question then remains, why? And here we have no answer as yet. And this is really at the core of what I called in an earlier slide, the Oxford wage debate. More workers working longer and harder in the market as a result of the consumer revolution, as a result of the arrival of tea and coffee and sugar and lighter fabrics, all those delightful things, many of which are addictive, that were becoming available even to workers from 1600 onwards, as De Vries has argued, and many people do believe play a role. But there are other potential sources of industriousness which are not so rosy, are not so optimistic for understanding living standards. One of these, which is raised, in fact, by Voth, by Hans-Joachim Voth in his early work on the length of the working year, and has been emphasized in my work with Sarah Horrell, is dependency. So if we want to think that the population growth of the era results in greater pressure on adults, on men and women in households, which I think is the case, then in fact, this may well have been a driver of industriousness. And of course, it's got a much less optimistic feel to it as an explanation than consumption aspirations. And thirdly, And this is something, Carmen and I were at a conference last week on freedom of work, and many contributions to that conference were emphasizing the importance of the way in which workers remain constrained, even coerced, within the context of an apparently free labor market. Coercion may well have been a powerful force in pressurizing workers to work longer and harder. The sources of coercion here in legal enforcement of labor market regulation, in the welfare system, in poor law becoming increasingly conditional, within the labor market itself and within social norms in terms of commitment to a duty to work. So conclusions very briefly then. The first is that I think this work challenges the traditional view. I've offered you a new series, which is based on annual wage rates, which we think is much likelier to get us to annual incomes than day wages grossed up, made with heroic assumptions about the length of the working year. And we've used that new series to try and get at the number of days worked. And we have two key findings. Modern economic growth begins earlier than industrialization and not after. And the main driving force was an industrious revolution, although the sources of that pressure to add days, hours of work for the market remains debated. So thank you very much.